In 1903, an Egyptologist named Howard Carter was excavating a site in the Valley of the Kings. He already had a reputation. Later, he would become one of the most famous archaeologists in history. But that morning, he was standing in front of a temple wall in Deir el-Bahari, studying a series of carved reliefs, and something was wrong. The wall showed a pharaoh, full royal regalia, the double crown, the crook and flail, the traditional pose of divine authority. But the face was gone. The cartouche, the carved royal nameplate, had been removed, replaced with another name. Everywhere Carter looked in this temple, the same thing had happened. A pharaoh had been here. Their image covered almost every wall. And then, at some point after their death, someone had come and tried to remove every trace of them from existence. Carter didn't know who had been erased. Nobody did. Not yet. It took years of investigation to understand the scale of what had been done. It wasn't one wall. It wasn't one temple. Across Karnak, one of the largest religious complexes in the ancient world, statues had been torn down. Cartouches had been chiseled off stone surfaces. Images had been replaced. New stone had been plastered over reliefs. At the Deir el-Bahari temple, a pit was eventually discovered containing dozens of smashed statues' heads separated from bodies, faces deliberately mutilated. Someone, at some point, had launched a systematic campaign to remove a pharaoh from history, and it had almost worked. If not for the carved reliefs and statues that were too far up to reach, or too buried to find, or too numerous to destroy in full, it would have worked completely. The pharaoh who had been erased was named Hatshepsut. She had ruled Egypt for more than 20 years. To understand what happened, you have to start at the beginning. Hatshepsut was born around 1505 BC, the daughter of Pharaoh Thutmose I, one of the most celebrated military rulers Egypt had ever had. From birth, she was positioned at the center of power. When Thutmose I died, the throne passed to his son by a lesser wife, Thutmose II. Hatshepsut married him. She became his great royal wife, the highest status a woman could hold in the Egyptian royal court. But Thutmose II was not a strong pharaoh. He was frequently ill. He ruled for a relatively short time. When he died, his chosen heir was a boy named Thutmose III, the son of a lesser wife, not Hatshepsut's child. Thutmose III was approximately 2 years old. Egypt needed a regent. Hatshepsut stepped in. A regency was normal. Egypt had seen regencies before. The expectation was that Hatshepsut would hold power temporarily, advise, govern, manage the administration until the boy was old enough to rule. That is not what happened. Roughly 7 years into her regency, Hatshepsut did something that had very rarely been done in 3,000 years of Egyptian history. She assumed the title of Pharaoh. Not queen, not regent, Pharaoh. She adopted the full royal titulary, the 5-part name that defined divine kingship. She wore the double crown. She carried the crook and flail. She had herself depicted in statues wearing the false beard of the male pharaoh. Thutmose III continued to reign alongside her as co-pharaoh. He was not removed. He continued his military training. He would eventually become one of the greatest military commanders in Egypt's history. But during the years of Hatshepsut's reign, she held the senior position. She was pharaoh. This was not a coup. That distinction matters. There is no record of military action, no record of violence, no record of anyone opposing her assumption of power. She had the support of Egypt's most powerful officials, including Senenmut, her chief steward and architect, who would become one of the most influential figures in her entire reign. She didn't take power by force. She convinced the existing power structure that she was the right person to hold it. So what did she do with it? The short answer is, she transformed Egypt. Hatshepsut launched one of the most ambitious building programs in the ancient world. She commissioned a pair of obelisks at Karnak that were, at the time, the tallest in existence, covered in electrum, an alloy of gold and silver, so they caught the sunlight and were visible for miles. She ordered the construction of the mortuary temple at el-Bahari, a three-tiered colonnaded structure built into the cliffs of the Valley of the Kings that modern architects still study for its precision and elegance. She sent a trading expedition to the land of Punt, a region in what is now the Horn of Africa, that returned with myrrh trees, ebony, ivory, gold, and exotic animals. The expedition was so successful that its story was carved into the walls of her temple in elaborate detail. Egypt grew wealthy under her reign. Trade expanded. Temples were built. The military was not neglected. She conducted successful campaigns in Nubia and Canaan. By any measure of effectiveness, she was a successful pharaoh. And then she died. Around 1458 BC, Hatshepsut died. She was probably in her mid-40s. Thutmose III, the co-pharaoh who had waited throughout her reign, now ruled alone. For roughly 20 years after her death, nothing unusual happened. Then the erasure began. For a long time, the explanation seemed obvious. Thutmose III had been sidelined. He had been the co-pharaoh, technically in line for the throne, while Hatshepsut held the senior position for over 2 decades. He must have resented her. He must have ordered the destruction of her memory in revenge. It is a satisfying story. It is also almost certainly not the full truth. Here is the complication. The erasure didn't start immediately after Hatshepsut's death. It began decades later, toward the end of Thutmose III's reign, when he was elderly, possibly dying. If this was personal revenge, why wait 20 years? Egyptologists who have studied this carefully now believe the erasure was likely more political than personal. Egypt had a problem that hadn't existed before Hatshepsut, the precedent of female kingship. Hatshepsut had been successful, undeniably, visibly, permanently successful. Her buildings stood everywhere. Her trading expeditions were legendary. Her military campaigns were recorded. That success was the problem. If a woman could rule Egypt this well, what did that mean for the traditional structure of divine male kingship that the entire Egyptian religious system was built upon? The erasure, most historians now believe, was not about hatred of Hatshepsut specifically. It was about erasing the precedent she had set. Erase her from the record, and the question she had answered so effectively, "Can a woman be pharaoh?" was never asked again. In the early 1900s, excavators working at el-Bahari found the pit. It was under the floor of the temple Hatshepsut had built as her monument to eternity. Inside were dozens of statues, heads, bodies, fragments. All of them were Hatshepsut. They had been smashed, deliberately, systematically smashed, and then buried in the ground. The people who destroyed them could have simply melted them down or thrown them in the Nile. Instead, they buried them beneath Hatshepsut's own temple. Nobody is certain why. One theory is that the burial was an act of respect, that the objects were too sacred to simply destroy, so they were interred rather than discarded. Another is that it was done in haste, with more erasure planned that was never completed. What is certain is this: when the pit was opened 3,000 years later, hundreds of fragments of Hatshepsut's image emerged from the ground. She was still there. Here is the thing about the obsession with erasing Hatshepsut. It reveals something uncomfortable about the people who did it. A pharaoh who had ruled badly, who had damaged Egypt, who was hated, nobody needed to erase them. The record of their failures would speak for itself. Hatshepsut was erased because she had done too well. Her success made her dangerous, not to any individual, but to a structure of belief that divine kingship was male, had always been male, would always be male. She hadn't threatened the empire with her power. She had threatened the story the empire told about itself, and the response to that was to remove her from the story entirely. It didn't work. We know her name. We've reconstructed her face from her mummy. We've matched her cartouches. We know exactly what she built, where she traded, which campaigns she commanded. 3,000 years of determined erasure, and she's still here. The obsession outlasted the people who had it. That is often how it goes. Hatshepsut was Pharaoh of Egypt for more than 20 years. She built some of the most enduring structures in the ancient world. She doubled the kingdom's trade wealth. She was depicted in stone as a divine ruler. And after her death, someone spent years of effort and resources trying to remove every trace that she had ever existed. They failed. Tell me in the comments, who do you think ordered the erasure? And do you think it was really about politics, or was it personal? Subscribe to Dark Histories for more.